Welcome to this video dedicated to the question of ordinary life, with a special focus on the 19th century, in both Britain and America. Today's video is sponsored by Victorian Cats, as you can tell from this particular photograph, an actual photograph of Victorian cats. So today we'll talk about work, and we'll talk about fun as well. We'll talk about leisure and pleasure and entertainment. The key questions are the following. How did life change for common people in the 19th century? When I say common people, I'm not trying to diss them. I'm not saying that they're not interesting. I'm a common person. What I mean is people who are not in extraordinary situations of power, for instance, kings or queens, or people who went high up, members of the government, for instance, just regular people, ordinary people. What was life like for them? I mean, what kind of job did they have? And we'll focus on the crazy jobs, on the disgusting jobs, on the difficult jobs. How did they have fun? What did they do for fun? Did they have time to have fun? And if so, what did they do with that time? What was their home life like? How did the house look like? What did the rooms look like? That sort of question is what we're going to be focusing on. So first, we'll discuss homes. Homes of those who were wealthy versus the homes of those who were less wealthy. Then we'll discuss work. And then we'll focus on leisure. In a way, the perspective that we're choosing for this particular lesson is very much the perspective of history from below. What does that mean? Well, for a long time, you could argue that history was done from above, meaning that those who would be the object of historical study would be the great man or the great women, but mostly the great man, noble subjects, like for instance, war. It might be surprising for you to hear that, but great conflicts, important conflicts, politics, as well. So this is what has been termed history from above because it studies history literally from a perspective that is high up. Now, this is different from the perspective of history from below, sometimes referred to in a slightly different way as people's history, which is the history of the common people, the regular people, not leaders, but everyday people, with a special focus on the voiceless, those who were considered as unreliable or at the bottom of society and therefore not worthy of discussion. Now you can take a few minutes to think about who would be the voiceless today, who would be the voiceless in the 19th century. In the lists, there would be, for instance, those who were put in mental asylums, those who were seen as mads, those who were criminals in prisons, and there are others that you can add to the list. Let's begin the study of ordinary lives with the home. There's no place like home, as the saying goes. So let's take a look at what life was like when people got home from work. Victorian homes were different depending on how wealthy you were. So the question is, where did British people live in the 19th century, both on a small scale and on a larger scale? What kind of homes would they have? What did they not have that we have today? And I'm not just talking about, technology, like computers and of course that kind of stuff, but what did they not have that we have? So you can pause the video at this point and think about what the house of a Victorian person would look like in Britain, or what the house of a 19th century person would look like in the US. What would they have? Imagine it and then continue. Most people, or at least more and more people, moved to the cities. This is something that we've discussed together, which meant that the cities tended to overflow, to be overpopulated with crowded housing, crammed homes in which people would be, stuck next to each other, close to each other in the house, with poor sanitation, something we've discussed as well in the past, and slums, neighborhoods that were that lacked proper sanitation, both in the homes and just generally speaking in the neighborhoods themselves. An illustration of slum housing in Providence Place, which is in London, and which dates back to the Edwardian period, not the Victorian period, to the early 20th century. And you can see the faces of the people living in those homes, and you can see the sheer number of people living in those homes. There was a lack of proper sanitation, and pollution was also a major issue in these neighborhoods, where there would be a clear lack of basic necessities such as drainage, running water, which led to the spread of diseases like cholera, for instance, and generally speaking, poor ability for people to have proper hygiene. There was a first step that was taken towards better sanitation in the very beginning of the Victorian period, actually, under the leadership of Edwin Chadwick. Edwin Chadwick decided to investigate the question of sanitation and published a report in 1842. His argument was that if the health of the poor were improved, it would result in less poor people wanting poor relief, meaning that it would be financially better for the states because they would have to invest less, because if people lived in better conditions, they would be in better health, and therefore they would not seek the help of the government. So you can see with that kind of reasoning how a Public Health Act was passed. It had many limits, but it sought to improve sanitation, giving the ability for local municipal places to create better living conditions for people living there. Let's talk about the toilets. If we're talking about sanitation, we need to discuss the evacuation of waste. Before the 1850s, in London, there were cesspits, les fosses d'aisance, ditches in which waste would go, and then it would be carried out, and eventually it would lead to the Thames. The majority of homes did not have any flush toilets. There were night soil men, which is a job that you would not like to have, because they would collect the solid part of the human waste. Don't watch this if you're eating some food. They would collect the solid part of the human waste and take it away to the countryside to use as fertilizer. Flush toilets appeared, however, in the mid-19th century. And there was a flush toilet that was part of the Great Exhibition that took place in London in 1851, and people would have to pay a penny to use the toilets, the facilities, which is why in English there's this expression that is to spend a penny when you want to say that you have to go to the toilet, because people would have to spend a penny to use the toilet. More than 800,000 people were seduced by the flush toilets of the Great Exhibition, spending a penny, literally and figuratively as well. I think that this requires some kind of illustration. This is not the original toilet that was used during the Great Exhibition, but this is a model of a water closet that was invented in 1870. Now, if we were to compare the homes that we've looked at, for instance, in Providence Place in London, with the homes that other people lived in, such as the one you have on screen, we noticed differences that were related to class. I invite you to perhaps pause the video and take a look at the home that you have in front of you. Compare it to the ones that you saw in Providence Place a little bit earlier on in the video, and try and see the differences in terms of size, in terms of the number of people that seemingly live in one place. Count the doors, very easy to count for this one. The windows as well, because the number of windows you have is important. If you don't have a lot of windows, it means that you probably don't live in a very nice home, or at least doesn't have a lot of light, which is never a good sign. So compare both images. You can also take a look at the type of interior that would be in a house like the one we've just seen in the previous slides, knowing of course that this isn't the actual interior of the house that we've seen. This is an ads catalogue from the 19th century. So you can see the type of stuff that would be in a home. So would this be a wealthy house, or would this be the house of people with less means? Fairly easy answer. It would be a wealthy house. So we noticed that there were big gaps in the UK based on how wealthy people were. They would have larger homes with more windows, less people living inside that home, so more room. But what about the US? Well-off people would also have roomy homes, whereas their servants, if they were wealthy enough to have any, would live in small rooms, so cramped quarters. For those who were poor, however, you'd find the same type of overcrowding as you find in the UK. There were slow improvements, that being said. 1% of US homes had electricity and indoor plumbing in 1920. That's very little, and we're looking at roughly 100 years ago. So very slow improvements, especially for those who did not have a lot of financial means. There are others who could afford very large estates, such as the one that you can see on screen. Because indeed, if you were doubting whether this was a person's actual home, yes, it is. This is a mansion, an estate that belonged to George and Edith Vanderbilt, who were extremely wealthy and lived in North Carolina. Now, their homes had 35 bedrooms, 43 bathrooms, 65 fireplaces, so it would keep warm in winter. There were more fireplaces than there are bathrooms or bedrooms for that matter. There would be a horse barn, there would be different types of gardens, formal garden, and who doesn't have an informal garden as well, of course. So you can see that there were big discrepancies and big social gaps in terms of homes. But let's focus on one of the most important rooms in the house. Of course, the bedroom is an important room because that's where we enjoy sleeping. But today we'll focus on the kitchen. You can see here a reproduction. It's not an actual photograph dating back from the time, of course, but this is a reproduction of a Brooklyn kitchen from the late 17th, early 18th century. Feel free to pause the video, take a close look at the image, at how foods would be cooked in particular. As you can see from the picture, for a long time back then and before that, food would be cooked over an open fire. It could be hung in pots. You could roast an animal on spits, on a long spits. So you had, for instance, type of job that would be spit boys. The people, the boys, the men actually, who would turn, for instance, a hog or an animal. And it would be a difficult job because you had to really crank it to really turn that spit, and you'd be very close to the fire, so you'd be quite hot and you don't want to get cooked yourself, of course. And water or liquids would be stored on shelves. There are changes that occur at different speeds based on different locations, based on the means of the people, whether they were wealthy or not. So the means of cooking the food and storing the food changed over time. For instance, a massive change was the invention, the creation, the production of a cast iron cooking stove that could be used with coal, du charbon, or wood burning, du bois, in the 1830s. So no longer an open fireplace, or an open fire, not fireplace, but open fire where you'd be cooking your food. This is an illustration of a kitchen area in the 1870s. So you can see that stove that has made an appearance, and it's no longer an open fire. This is an illustration of a kitchen in the 1910s. So you can see the changes that have occurred in 40 years or thereabouts, with cupboards to put the utensils and the plates and things that you might need as well. As you can guess, this is not the kitchen of a poor, this would not be the kitchen that a poor family could afford. This is a stove, an electric stove dating back from 1912, which has two ovens, the top units, and an automatic time. As you can see, the clock, like literally it's an actual clock, which I find quite delightful, and some heat control. So, it means that in terms of cooking, you could be a lot more precise and a lot more specific. The Book of Household Management was published in the UK in the 19th century, and it's delightful. I invite you to take a look at the Book of Household Management, in which you have illustrations that give you an idea of what upper middle class families would eat and cook. My favorite recipe is the recipe of toast sandwiches, which is basically toasts with toasts inside it. It's a toast sandwich. The Book of Household Management that you've just seen appeared in the 1860s. It was written by Mrs. Isabella Beeton when she was very young, only 25, and it became a huge success. It was a bestseller, the 50 Shades of the time. Well, not exactly, but it did contain interesting advice on top of the 2,000 or so recipes that were in the book. For instance, you'd learn how to judge the character of your servants. So you can tell that this was not directed at people without a lot of financial means. You could learn the best way to roast a guinea pig, and if you're not sure what a guinea pig is, look it up. Bon appétit. Don't thank me. How to cultivate a good temper. There's also lots that's basically how to be a good woman, a good housewife. How to make Christmas plum pudding. How to fold napkins into slipper or cactus shapes. How to revive low flowers after packing, etc., etc. And also advice on how to cure a cold, or generally speaking, how to take care of the sick. Now, there were developments, of course, after the 19th century. In the 1930s, for instance, we see refrigerators making an appearance. But in the UK, you'd have to be pretty wealthy to own one. These were expensive items, even then. This is the 1950s, where you can see the kitchen changing, but the person in the kitchen, still women back then. If you look at pictures from the 1990s, you'd also see women featuring prominently in kitchen. In the kitchen. We see the rise of shopping as well in the 19th century, with, for instance, promotional ads for desiccated coconut. This is what you can see on screen. I've zoomed in on part of the ads on which you can see the noix de coco written in French, so exotic products that would be advertised in a way that would be completely unacceptable nowadays, of course. Some items were luxury items that came from the empire and that people enjoyed greatly when they could afford it. So you can look at the list, pause, to think about which would be luxuries. For instance, milk wouldn't be a big luxury because people had had milk before, but tea would come from faraway places, sugar as well. Potatoes was an everyday item, definitely not something that's luxurious. Neither would be eggs because people could have chickens. However, fruit or fish as well, which meant that you had to have ice to keep your fish fresh. An ice box would be items that would be sought after. Bread was an everyday item, definitely not luxurious. With the Industrial Revolution, we see the mass production of various goods. For instance, preserves, des conserves, in bottles or in tins, things that you can keep in your kitchen and that you can eat, not necessarily immediately, that you can keep for a while. Imperial food would be quite popular. We've discussed the desiccated coconuts, but you also have ads from the late 19th century promoting various things using various techniques. For instance, this is the equivalent of a celebrity promoting, or celebrity being used to promote a certain type of cake by a company. The princess is used, her image is used to make people want to buy that. So you can think about the equivalent of that nowadays, a celebrity endorsing a product or their image being used to endorse the product. This is an ad for stout. Look it up. Stout is a type of beer, and it would not be an acceptable ad nowadays because the ad tells us that this beer is for invalids, and there's a woman saying it literally saved her life. So you can see how that wouldn't fly nowadays. I like this Bovril ads, which was used to prevent a chill. It's like a cold remedy. It's the brands that exists. And it dates back to the late 19th century, and you can see a woman leaving her bathing machine. If you haven't had the pleasure of finding out about bathing machines, look them up. Now, what kind of work did people have once they left their homes? Where did they go and work? I want to focus today not on the jobs that we've discussed before, but on the difficult jobs, the ones that were gross, that were disgusting, that were exhausting, or that were dangerous, because the idea is to focus on the lives of people who were not necessarily given a voice, and to, in a way, perhaps pay tribute to them, or at least discuss those jobs that are not always well known. We've talked about pieces before. These were the children who worked in textile factories and who would tie together broken threads, so they would piece it together. This way it's called piecing. Scavengers we've discussed together. Those would often be children who would crawl under the spinning mules, under the big machines that would spin the cotton to clean up fallen material. And you'll remember that these were very dangerous jobs that could lead to injury or loss of limb even. Now, one we haven't discussed together is a leech collector. People going into ponds or rivers to catch leeches. Des sangsues, oui, des sangsues. That was used for medical reasons, which you know because we've talked about medical breakthroughs and medical changes in lecture number 4. If you remember. Now, Toshers did a very difficult, gross job. They collected items that they would find in the sewers. In other words, they had to go through people's shits to find valuable items that might have made their way into the sewers and then try and sell them and make money out of them. Now, what about jobs in America? We haven't discussed those as much as we've discussed jobs in Britain. Of course, there was factory work with difficult working conditions and very long hours, but interestingly, it led to the creation of unions and sometimes big strikes, big boycotts that you can feel free to look into. So it's not fair to say that there were never any kind of strikes in the US. There were. Jobs that remains, well, perhaps not popular, but in existence in the 19th century in certain areas that perhaps will surprise you. wagon makers, saloon keepers, cobblers as well were important and vital, tailors, like to make homemade clothing, tailor-made clothing, farmers as well. So even if we talk a lot about the Industrial Revolution, it doesn't mean that there wasn't also a need for people to farm the lands. It all focused on an interesting type of job, telegraph operators. You can see a photograph on your screen of a woman working as a telegraph operator with all those cables that she would have to move around. In 1900, the average work week in manufacturing in the US was about 53 hours of work per week. And this went down to 42 hours almost a century later. We notice that 42 hours is still not negligible for jobs that can be quite demanding physically and quite tiring physically. So there is still, there is still room for improvement in that respect. Now, one last word regarding the question of work about children. We've talked about child labour, and we've mentioned gradual legislation, for instance, the Factory Act in 1833. But there was legislation that was passed to really restrict the use of children in any kind of employment when they were under 14 in 1933. And in the US, about the same time, there was a federal law that also restricted the use of children under 14 in various types of employments. Now, work is one thing, but what about leisure? Did people have time to enjoy themselves and do something that was not actual work, to have fun, basically? Now, I want you to look at those kids building a sandcastle in this 1880 illustration and think about all the things you associate with going to the seaside. When you think about going to the beach, what do you think of? Perhaps sandcastles for children. Perhaps, enjoying dipping your feet in the water even when it's a little cold. Notice how the children are dressed, though. They're not wearing, swimsuits, and they've got their hats on, so you can tell a lot as well about their social class from this. Maybe you're thinking about ice cream as well, which became popular in the late 19th century on certain beaches. So we see, generally speaking, a rise of leisure, and this is partly because people had better wages and more time. There was a Bank Holiday Act that was passed in the 19th century, the second half of the 19th century, that allowed people sometimes to take a little break away from their homes and their cities. Short break, but a break nonetheless. The seaside was popular. It was associated with childish innocence, like playing with a bucket, using a spade, and building sandcastles. Nature as well would be seen sometimes even as a remedy against ailments and illnesses. Old-fashioned fun, donkeys, roundabouts, boat trips, but also foods, informal foods that would have been seen as a little bit outrageous because you would eat it with your fingers without conventional table manners, without a fork and a knife. You would eat it with, your hands, your fish and chips, your ice cream. Well, of course, hold the ice cream with your hands. Don't take the ice cream in your hands. But you see what I mean, like food that is not eaten at a table. So there's that freedom, that liberation that comes with it. But sports also became quite popular, more and more popular. You can see here different images of different sports that were popular back then. They were a popular form of leisure for men in particular, and for boys as well, because athleticism carried certain values that became quite central to masculine identities. The idea of being fair play, the idea of self-control, the idea of virility often was associated with the practice of one sport or another. Some of them were seen as perhaps too violent, too immoral, and others were more valued. Now, of course, football was very popular, as you probably know, because it still is popular in the UK. It was enjoyed by men of all social classes, even though those who were wealthy tended to see amateur football as superior. Because they were wealthy, they didn't necessarily need to get paid for that. There were different sets of rules depending on the place where it would be played. So the Football Association was created in 1863 to make practices more harmonious. And supporting different football teams became a key element of men's identities. It would lead to pride when your team would win. It could be that you supported a local team, but also a regional team on a larger scale and a national team on an even larger scale. There were rivalries and different clubs, and people would sing songs, and people would wear certain types of jerseys or the colors of their teams. For instance, this is Aston Villa, if I'm not mistaken, that you can see here wearing their jerseys, les maillots, and these would be immediately recognizable. Boxing was not seen as very moral. It was closely associated with working class type of entertainment, associated with the pub, with gambling, with sometimes even criminality, and it was a profit-oriented sport, meaning that you could bet on a boxing match. It was an opportunity for men belonging to the working class to display their strength, to show how tough they were as men. So it was also interesting and important in the way men constructed their identities. There were rules that were created in the 1860s as well to make it safer and to discuss what was allowed and what was not allowed. But there were still fears that it would be immoral, especially coming from the middle classes that tended to want entertainment to be moral, to be proper, to be respectable. Now, maybe you're thinking, but what about women? What kind of sports did women practice? And you can pause the video and think about the types of sports that you think women would probably be allowed to do. In the late Victorian periods, there was a new approach to physical exercise and training, and women were interested in that. A new approach that argued that it was good for people's health, as you must know, and that it would make women healthier. But that being said, there were fears that certain sports would not be good for them. So there was a limited array of options because women supposedly had very delicate, graceful constitutions that would not be compatible with sports that were seen as too violent for them or too physical for them. But there were women who advocated sports for women. You can see here an illustration of different sports. So you'll have to recognize, for instance, a woman and her bicycle. Bicycles were fundamental in the emancipation of women in the late 19th century, especially because it entailed a different way of dressing, of course. You can see a team or a bunch of women with tennis rackets, and you can see a woman, she was a special suffragette, training other suffragettes, doing jiu-jitsu to a policeman for a demonstration. A little bit of a focus on cycling, because cycling was important, as I was saying, in terms of emancipation. Women could and did practice sports, but that was, as we were saying, carefully monitored, regulated, and circumscribed. I'm quoting a historian who focused on that question. Her name is Mengen. And despite those limits, women did practice some sports. For instance, here you can see women cycling. Look at the bicycles. Take some time to describe it. Look at the different wheels. Imagine how difficult it would be to get on that bicycle. Imagine why would bicycles look like that, and why did they change Think about those questions. Now, for some, including women, sports could be seen as unwomanly and unsexing, like something that would make women less like women. And it would be bad for their bodies, and the type of sports that would be recommended by those people would often be dancing, for instance. Now, from tobogganing, illustrated on your screens, to roller skating, illustrated on your screens as well, in America. My message to you right now is just keep rolling, keep going forwards, keep going ahead. Don't give up. For week 10, revise the lessons that we've had together. Finish the timelines that you've started. Remember, you only need to select the key events so that you don't get lost in a sea of events and dates. Hierarchy is fundamental. And come to the best quiz of your lives. You'll enjoy it, you'll tell your friends about it, you'll tell your families about it. Hopefully, if we can do it. Take care of yourselves. And for those of you who want to, you can come at 4 p.m. on Big Blue Button for a very short sort of vide class session where you can ask questions about the exam, where you can vent some of your feelings, or you can just get a chance to say hi for a few minutes just so that we can reconnect. Take care.